Okay. So first off, if everybody could mute while we are while our speakers are speaking, and to begin with, just welcome, thank you, good evening. Thank you for joining us for tonight's special presentation, Magefah, Pandemics Throughout Jewish History. My name's Daniel Reinhold. I'm Dean of the Bernard Revel Graduate School of Jewish Studies, and I'll be hosting this evening, which thankfully will mainly involve my sitting back and listening to our panel as you will. But by way of very brief introduction, we thought that as we hope that we're beginning to see the light at the end of the tunnel of the COVID pandemic and pray that the positive progress made continues, it would be interesting to utilize the considerable expertise that we have in Jewish history at Revel to pause and reflect on pandemics throughout Jewish history. So tonight you're going to hear from three of Revel's internationally renowned history faculty, namely Dr. Richard Hidary, Professor of Jewish History, Dr. Ronnie Perelis, who holds the Chief Rabbi, Dr. Isaac Abraham and Yelena Rachel Alkali Chair in Sephardic Studies, and Dr. Jess Olsen, who's also Professor of Jewish History at Yeshiva University since 2007. They represent our, excuse me one second, there we are, our ancient, medieval and modern history departments, which are but 3 of the 6 departments with whom you can study at Revel, something that I would encourage you all to do. Tonight's going to proceed as follows. We're going to hear short 15-minute presentations from our presenters, following which we'll have some time to put questions to them. So if you have questions, please feel free to put them into the chat, and I'll endeavor to put as many of them as I can to our panel once the presentations are over. So in the meantime, if everybody could be on mute, without further ado, we're first going to hear from Dr. Richard Hidary, Associate Professor of Jewish History, who teaches Dead Sea Scrolls, Midrash and Talmud, and has particular expertise in reading the Talmud against the background of Greco-Roman culture. And his topic tonight is 24,000 students, Talmudic teachings on loss and survival during a pandemic. Dr. Hidary.
Thank you, Dean Reinhold. Wonderful to be here together with everyone. I want to thank the Dean and Rona and all those who organized this event. And thank you everyone who came to participate. You're reminding me with the 24,000 students to count the Omed, but it's still a little bit too early. So hopefully sometime in the middle if you see me stand up. As I remember over a year ago, I think the first Shabbat that our Bet Knesset was closed was the Shabbat before Rosh Chodesh Nisan. And I remember reciting the Birkat HaChodesh, not on Shabbat, obviously, but on Friday, as we prepared for Shabbat, we were announcing the coming Rosh Chodesh. And we said the Yehi Ratzons that we do every month for, every year for decades. But I don't think I ever paid attention to a couple of words in it, which is L'rachem al pletatenu v'la'atzor ha'magefah v'hamashrit v'acherev, right? To have mercy on us and to stop the plague. And as I saw that, noticed many times throughout the tefillah that mentions David and Magefah, the kind of words that otherwise I would say, okay, this is a remnants from some ancient historical time, but now it became immediately relevant and meaningful and impactful. And since then, every time we go through those words, I have extra kavanah. And that was a great reminder of the fact that this is not the first time in the history of mankind. It may be the first time when we have something that is so surrounding the entire world, involving all of the entire human, all of humanity. So the extent of it, but not the first time that Jews or other nations have experienced these plagues more locally. And for me, I had a sense of comfort. I always like learning history and Jewish history because you find kindred voices, and if you're suffering through a problem and someone comes to visit you that had a similar problem, then you feel a little bit of relief knowing that there's someone else that's thinking the same thing and suffering through the same thing as you are. So I began to look through the Talmud, the rabbis who wrote these prayers, and when they did, as it happened every few years, a lot more often than to us. We luckily haven't had to experience this for 100 years. Nobody in living experience, unless I don't know how old everyone is here. So going back to the Talmud, and sure enough, there is really a lot of wisdom. And so I'd like to review just a few Talmudic sources, and we'll end with a discussion of Rabbi Akiva and his students. So I'm going to share a few of the sources so that we can read them together. Can everybody see Magefah, Epidemics? Great. Well, I'll begin with the Mishnah in Masechet Ta'anit, all about days in which we as a community fast, mostly when it doesn't rain for a long time. But then it says here also a city which has a plague, that city will fast and they will sound a blast of a shofar. And that's the city itself. The places around it will fast, but not sound the shofar. So the place where it's the most intense will blow shofar and fast and prayer, of course. And those surrounding, I think, make sense. First of all, they care about their neighboring city. And also, who knows if such a thing can spread to them. So already we see the first response would be to establish official prayer, right? They would get up and announce it. And that would mean that the whole community would, stop work, come out to the courtyard, and have a day of intense introspection and tefillah. Now, how do you define a plague? So it's not just there's an exact definition for this because there's always people that get sick. But how do you know when it's actually called David? And the answer is if in a city that can supply 500 foot soldiers, 3 deaths occur on 3 consecutive days, then that is a plague, but not less. It was very interesting. I did a little calculation, just assuming an average size family and city. I think this would be 1 out of 5,000 people dying each day, right, for 3 days in a row. So compared to what we are going through, at least in the United States, this would be about 40, 50 times worse. So these plagues, I think, were maybe a shorter time and localized, but they would be quite devastating. And just we can only imagine that what would these communities had to go through, and coming together, supporting each other, coming with tefillah would be a source of strength and help them get through those difficult times. So that's source number 1. Source number 2 has been Pirkei Avot that says, David ba'ala olam al mitot hamudot ba'torah. It's giving examples. Pestilence comes sometimes on account of transgression as a punishment for various things. For example, not using the fruit that grew on the 7th year. So this is a second response of introspection. What can we do better, right? What can we have done to prevent this and rectify our own actions? So let's put those, remember these, right? So tefillah and repentance. And but we find a whole bunch of other sources that add even more to that. And the next source is the Mechilta, but it's based on a pasuk in Yeshaya, which as soon as you'll read it, you'll see why it's relevant. And here it says, Lech ami bo b'chaderecha, go my people, enter into your chambers, into your rooms, and lock the doors behind you, because there's danger outside. And so stay inside, quarantine until the danger passes. And so this is, Mechilta is going to pick up on this. Regarding the pasuk in Shemot, where Hashem tells the people, Moshe tells the people, do not leave your homes. But this is before the plague of the firstborn, makat bechorot. So it says everybody stay at home. I remember there was a meme going around probably a year ago, when around Pesach time, when it says Moshe tells the people, stay in your homes, and the people say, okay, we'll stay in our homes except to go to shul, right? And Moshe says, no, don't, not even that, stay as okay, we understand, but we can go to the restaurant and then come right back. So no, not even that, just stay in your homes. Okay, so the pasuk is then wondering, why the Israelites had to stay in the Midrash is wondering why the Israelites have to stay in their homes. After all, Makat Bechorot would only be for the Egyptians, and the answer is quite profound. Once permission is given to the destructive force to destroy, it does not distinguish between righteous and wicked. So, even if it's only one person that goes to a wet market and does something irresponsible, right? Once, or people, flying when they're sick, or, all kinds of other actions, once it spreads, then everybody, the collective, is responsible and the collective suffers. So this, I think, is in addition to what we learned before, which is repentance. This is a general a blanket recognizing the spread of disease. Okay, and from that, we'll go to a Talmudic source, which I guess is the kind of locus classicus for this subject. Here, the Talmud Bavli in Bava Kama quotes that midrash that we just said, and then goes on and says, when there is a plague in the city, you should gather your feet together, meaning don't go outside too much. And quoting those verses that we just mentioned. It wonders, why do we quote more than one verse for the same thing, meaning that you should not go outside? And says, well, you might have thought this is only at nighttime. Don't go out at night. In general, not a good idea to go out at night. It's dangerous. It was dangerous then, today too. But you might think in the daytime it's okay. And so therefore, the extra verses come to teach not only, right, from the pasuk in Shemot that says, don't leave your house till morning. So that just teaches you at night. These other pasukim say, no, even in the daytime, it's not a matter of day or night of bad guys around, but rather once this disease, a plague is out, it's best to stay home. So they I think recognize from their own experience this wisdom. And if you would say that this matter applies only where there is no fear inside, but when there is fear inside, what if this just reminds me of the kind of terrible one of the consequences of quarantine is a domestic abuse arise in it when people are stuck at home, and we've heard a little too much about that. So you might think, well, if there's maybe it's not dangerous, maybe it's dangerous inside too. Nevertheless, the danger outside, at least in that case, was worse. So remain inside. After that, Rava gives his own advice and says, when there was a plague, he would close the windows of his house to make sure nothing got in. So that's a good ventilation. And finally, if there's a plague in the city, a person should not walk in the middle of the road because that's where the danger is, but rather go to the side of the road. And I would call this social distancing. So we see, whether whatever medical knowledge they had a sense of there's forces, malevolent forces around. They didn't have the name viruses, but they understood how this works and that it does go through the air, and that's why Rava closes windows. And the rabbis taught quarantine, good ventilation, and social distancing. So that's quite amazing. In addition, of course, to tefillah and teshuvah. And so I'll end my comments with Rabbi Akiva and the 24,000 students that's relevant to this time period. This is, it looks like a complicated chart, and sorry I didn't bring English because I wanted to show the relationship between three different texts. I'm going to focus on the Talmud Bavli in Masechet Yevamot, but there is an earlier parallel in Bereshit Rabbah and Avot Rabbi Natan. The context is that saying that if you do things when you're young and you accomplish things, then don't give up, continue accomplishing when you're old. If you learn Torah when you're young, continue to learn Torah when you're old. Don't say, I finished Shas already. If you have children when you were young, continue and have more children when you're older. Who knows which of the children will be successful? And as an example, we bring Rabbi Akiva, who raised students and taught when he was young, but then taught more students when he was old. Why did he have to do that? Because here it is, 12,000 pairs of students Rabbi Akiva had, from Migebet ad Antipras, from this city to that city, and they all died. They all died in the same period because they did not treat each other with respect. And Bereshit Rabbah has something very similar. The reason is also similar because Anehem Sara Elu Be'elu, because their eyes were thin, meaning they were stingy with each other. So similar, not showing respect. And at that time, the whole world was empty of Torah knowledge because all of these students had died, until Rabbi Akiva came and he gathered together 5 more students and was able to teach them. And these are the major sages of the Mishnah. And now that we have a parallel in Bereshit Rabbah, but the next part has no parallel. Tana, a Braita, Kula metu mipesach v'ad aseret. We know that it was at one time period, precisely when? Now, during this time period between Pesach and Shavuot. And we still don't know how they died. And this was the next line comes to add, Rav Chama bar Abba, and some say the Bichia bar Avin, Kula metu mitar ha'amai Rab Nachman, Amar Rab Nachman, Askara. It was a terrible death, a disease called Askara. So here we learn that it was in fact from some kind of disease, some kind of plague that spread around them. Now historians wonder if there's a connection between Rabbi Akiva as Rabbi Akiva's political activity as the spiritual head of the Bar Kochba revolt, and perhaps these students were involved, in fact, in that war, and so we wonder if this mass death was caused because of their involvement in the war. So that seems like a good likely historical possibility, and I don't think it contradicts the Talmud Bavli because, as you probably know, a lot of the time, even in war, probably more soldiers die from disease just from being in camps than on the actual battlefield. So that would be the historical context that would make sense of this. Nevertheless, we see that the Talmud does not emphasize the political aspect, but rather the social aspect, the mitzvot ben adam lachavero, that did not treat each other with respect. And I think that's such an important lesson that when tragedy does strike, when bad things happen, the one question is, what can we do to prevent this? How can we keep ourselves safe? But the other question is more thinking about each other. And as a reminder that we need each other, we're so dependent on each other. And this international pandemic has reminded us more than ever. I think Israel being at the forefront and first country to vaccinate most of its citizens is a wonderful Kiddush Hashem, and showing that when we work together and take initiative, we can limit the consequences and save many lives. So taken together, I feel a tremendous amount of comfort knowing that I can connect with the generations before us and the sages before us. And so we're not unique in our suffering, and we can learn from their wisdom and be inspired. And hopefully through that, we can all get through this together. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hidary. Seeing some of those texts makes one think plus ça change, as we say in England. So we will next hear from Dr. Ronnie Perelis, who holds the Chief Rabbi Dr. Isaac Abraham and Yelena Rachel Alkali Chair in Sephardic Studies. And he likes to explore the complexity and the dynamism of Sephardic history with his students at YU. And his research investigates connections between Iberian and Jewish culture during medieval and early modern periods. Dr. Perelis will speak on dancing with death, life, death, and the plague in Sepharad. Dr. Perelis.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Rona, for getting this together. And thank you, my colleagues, my dear friend, Professor Olson, Professor Hidary. It's really an honor to be here tonight and to travel through time with you. I'm going to just share my screen briefly. So for some of you, when you think of the Black Death, maybe you go here to this iconic scene from Ingmar Bergman's The Seventh Seal. I have very distinct memories of seeing it as a Shana Bet student in Israel at the Cinematheque in Yerushalayim, and it just I've been thinking about this, and tonight we're going to look at a very different engagement with death and the personification of death, one that exists in a genre that you find throughout Western Europe, the Dance Macabre, the Dance of Death, Danza de la Muerte in Spain. And we're going to look at it really to see what does it tell us actually, not about death and not about facing the plague as much as what might this poem tell us about life and culture and society at the time. What can it tell us about what it meant to be a Jew living in medieval Spain? And you know, one of the classic conceptions for thinking about life in medieval Spain is this idea of convivencia, of living together, which is so often invoked. And it's often invoked either in very binary, extreme ways. Either it was this paradise of multicultural tolerance, everyone got along, or it's some kind of zero-sum game hellscape of forced conversions and wars, and the reality is, of course, complicated, nuanced, and much more interesting than either of those binaries. And I think this poem that we're going to look at a few stanzas together, highlights that and shows us some of that complexity. So this comes from one of the manuscripts. It was a 15th century manuscript based on earlier oral traditions that circulated throughout Spain. There are parallels to this idea of a dance of death. There's a character that's personified as death that comes down and invites, not so nicely, but invites all sorts of characters of medieval society to come join her or him, depending. In Spanish and in other Romance languages, it's female, so there's a feminine side to it, to dance, and with that dance, then they're dispatched to the netherworld, and you see this, like I said, you see this depicted in different ways throughout Europe. Sometimes it's on frescoes. There are poems. And in Spain, we have evidence that this was actually performed as a dance often, that there were performances at royal weddings and things like this of the Dance of Death. And it all comes out after the plague. The plague hits Spain in different waves from different directions, but more or less 1348 is the beginning of that, and it goes on for a different couple of years. There's another wave 10 years later, it returns. And it had, just to give a little background, it had obviously devastating effects on all of Europe. All of the Mediterranean suffered tremendously. In places like France and Germany, it's very well known that Jewish communities were often targeted as this cause of this mysterious illness, and there were terrible attacks on the Jews. In Spain, we have some evidence of that, mostly in Aragon and Catalonia, those areas closer to France. It really kind of traveling with the plague, you get the sort of Northern European style of anti-Semitism that then infects the Kehilot of Aragon and Catalonia, and with massacres in many places. Some places the authorities were able to protect, in other places they weren't. And Susan Einbinder wrote a fantastic book about the Black Death in France and in Spain. Highly recommend it, and I've learned a tremendous amount from it. And she kind of charts some of that terrible violence. But in any case, this poem existed in oral form, gets written down in the 15th century. We also have a aljamiado version of this poem. Aljamiado comes from the Arabic word alhama, which refers to a kehillah, and it's the way that Jews and Muslims referred to their own kihilot, to their own neighborhoods and their culture. And so an Al-Hamiyado text is another way of saying vernacular in Hebrew letters or vernacular in Arabic letters. And so we have also this poem in that form, in that Hebraized form as well, which is fascinating. It was recently discovered only, about 20 years ago in Parma. Okay, so let's take a look. And the translation is mine, for better or for worse. And I'm going to focus in on some of the last stanzas. It goes through everyone in society. It goes through nobles. It goes through soldiers, princesses, maidens. It goes through the Pope. The Pope also dies. Priests die, monks die, nuns die, everyone dies, right? Judges die. And then we get to the part which is particularly Spanish, particularly reflective of a community where you don't only have Christians, where there are Jews, where there are Muslims, and where those Jews and Muslims aren't just phantasms of the imagination. They're not just a couple Jews here and there and really existing in the demonology really of the religion, of the majority religion, but actually people of flesh and blood who live side by side, who you could find in any town in the region, and who are an integral part of life. And so we're going to see a little of that. But I want to start with the previous, the person that comes before the Jew, which is a San Christian, right? Basically a shamish, as we would say, a sexton in English. And we see him being portrayed as a, yes, he has a religious calling, but he also likes to have a little bit of the good life, enjoys hanging out late at night with his friends and playing around with all sorts of mistresses. So we see here, making the rounds, no, you no longer can, nor bring your lady her jewels. So if you would like, I will take you away right now, Death says to the sexton. Come forth, Rabbi, and here you will daven. Now, in Spanish, venid vos, Rabbi, acá meldaredes. Meldar is a very particular verb found, in my experience, really, you almost only find it among the Spanish-speaking Jews of Morocco. And it means to pray, it means to read, to study, to go and study Torah. And so it literally means to read, but it has this very particular religious liturgical sort of reading. To make it more current and American, I used the word daven, which even though is Yiddish, it's American Jewish English. And so that's my choice. And I'm open to criticism for it. And we can talk about it. But the fact that this not only has the word Rabbi pronounced properly, but also using the specific word that Christians don't use, right? That the Jews use. They knew, this author knew that the Jews use this word to talk about their prayers. And here again, we see more instances of intimacy, of knowledge, of identification and understanding. We have the Hebrew word for Lord. Dios de Abraham, God of Abraham. Right, so the rabbi responds to death. He sees death, and what does the rabbi say? Oh, Elohim and God of Abraham, you promised the redemption. I don't understand what you are doing to me with such fanfare. You command me to dance, but I don't know the tune. And there is no man in the world of all those that exist who can escape from your command. Help me, Dayanim, because my understanding is slipping because of this great affliction. Valed me Dayanes. Again, use of Hebrew, an intimate term, not just the stock term, but again, reflective of knowledge and specificity. And then death responds to him. And death is not nice to anyone, by the way. Death is not respectful to anyone. That's part of the fun of this dark, morbid humor. And the reality, this is kind of a post-traumatic response to this terrible plague that devastated people's lives. You have this kind of way of playing, right? Of playing with death. And so death says to the rabbi, Don Rabbi Barbudo. I'm sure I could come up with a better one here, but bushy beard, Barbudo means someone with a big beard. Now he refers to him as Don, right, which is a title of respect. It's like sir. It comes from the Latin dominus, not adon, although that is a very creative etymology. Don Rabbi, who spends his day studying the Talmud and its commentaries, and yet in truth you never took care to guard against those things which would bring you punishment and pain. Get over here with the dancers and sing out your beracha. I will give you a dwelling place along with Rabbi Asa. Come now, al-Faqih, leave off your delicacies. So again, we have bracha. He refers to Rabbi from the Gemara. There's some questions among the commentators on this poem. Which is this he talking about, an actual rabbi of the time? Is he just referring to a Talmudic rabbi? But again, yes, there's humor. Yes, there's kind of a caricature, right? The bushy bearded rabbi who studies Talmud all day. But again, there's an understanding Jews study Talmud. Jews don't study just the Bible, right? That is particularly Jewish. And knowing the word beracha, there is a wonderful article by Yirmiyahu Yovel about the popular poets of the mid-15th century, many of whom were of converso origin.
Create a documentary film, Memories of the
Art. Who incorporated all sorts of Hebrew words into their poems when they were making fun of themselves and their Jewish origin. So this is existing in that world where a general Christian audience would know what a beracha is. Again, it tells you something about the specificity of this world. And then we turn to the Muslim scholar, to the judge, the al-Faqih. Again, using the Islamic term, the Arabic term, and look at, again, we have all these really specific references to the Muslim. First of all, Allah, indeed, this is serious business. This which you command me to do, I have a discreet and gracious wife with whom I have enjoyed and given pleasure. These are caricatures, right? The idea that that Islam prizes earthly pleasures. This is a very common caricature. And you see that, but then you see other things here. Let's just go to the end here. Come now, my friend, leave off the pleasure garden. And he uses this word rayyan, which is an Arabic word. To Gehinnom you will be cast. It's a word that's shared by Jews and Muslims. And he refers to the 27th of Ramadan. And you won't make it to Mecca for Eid either. And he says, listen, the Moreria, the Muslim neighborhood, they'll hire another al-Faqih. I'm sorry, we have to move on now. We're gonna go to the Santero, the person who crafts the statues. So this poem is a living document reflective of the way that people live their lives. There was tension, there was mockery, there was hatred, but there was also living together. There was also knowledge. There was also a way that, especially in light of the existential reality of death, there's an understanding that we all die, right? Each in our particularity, but we all die. And I want to end with this image. This is from the tomb of Ferdinand III, who was the great conqueror of the Muslim South, right? In the wars of the Christians against the Muslims. He conquered the great cities of the South, with the exception of Granada. He conquered Cordoba and Murcia, and lastly, Seville. And Seville was his great prize. It's where he built this enormous cathedral, and he wanted to be buried there. But he planned his tomb to be reflective of his kingdom. So on the opposite side of this tomb, you would find his epitaph in Latin and in Castilian. And on this side, divided by the castle of Castile and the Lion of Leon, his shield, his coat of arms that you see going down here, we have Hebrew and we have Arabic, the same epitaph translated into these languages. The dates correspond to the way that a Jew would put the date to Briat Olam, and a Muslim would do it to the Hajj, and the Hijra, I'm sorry. And so there's an acknowledgement. They would use Allah when they're talking about God. And so remember, this is not a peace-loving Christian. This is the conqueror, the person who took back these cities for Christianity, who destroyed the beautiful mosque of Seville and put up the enormous cathedral of Seville. And yet there's a sense that we live together. We are here together in this complex, tense mix. And one of the things about this last year has shown us that we all share the same fate, and yet we are all bound together, as Professor Hidary was pointing to. But what that looks like, and what's that going to look like the day after, or the weeks after, or the years after we wake up from this time period, is up to us and how we craft that living together. So with that, we turn to the modern age. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Perelis. So finally, we're going to hear from Dr. Jess Olsen, who's been professor of Jewish history at Yeshiva University since 2007, and whose areas of expertise include 19th and 20th century European and American Jewish history, and the history and theory of critical psychoanalysis. Dr. Olsen's topic is 1990 to 2020, Jews and 2 centuries of pandemics. Dr. Olsen.
Thank you very much, and it's such a pleasure to be here. And I just want to speak my appreciation to my learned colleagues. These were outstanding talks, and it's just such an honor to be a part of this group. So I'm going to talk today about illness in society. Now, the idea for this talk came to me from a book that I think should be on everybody's shelf around about now, and that is Epidemics in Society from the Black Death to the Present by Frank Snowden. This came out with Yale University Press. Now, what's really exciting about this book, right, is that he posits that thinking about history through the lens of infectious disease actually gives us an entirely new perspective on history, right? That this isn't that the idea of pandemic is a huge part of human history, has massive implications on politics, on society, on culture, that often gets sort of like unnoticed, right? Because we tend to pay attention to people, we tend to pay attention to famous rulers, we tend to pay attention to important events. But what looking at history through the lens of illness, of mass illness, it changes our sense of periodicity, how we understand the arrangement of time. It changes our perspectives of time and space, and it changes our understanding of culture and politics. And so I want to take this new perspective to ask a central question. How do 2 pandemics a century apart, that is the great influenza pandemic of 1918-1919 and the current COVID pandemic of 2020-2021, how do these 2 pandemics a century apart frame Jewish history? What comes to surface that allows us to see things a little bit differently? So the focus on my remarks are going to be on viewing late modern Jewish history through the lens of these bookend pandemics. 1919 through 2020 brackets two radically different realities of Jewish life worldwide. And to take kind of an overarching view, and it may be a kind of a superficial view, but I'm just going to posit the thesis that what we see from this is the contrasting experience of Jews in a world of insecurity in 1919 versus Jews in a world of security in the present time. All right. So let's talk about basic background. So the 1919 pandemic, let's go back to 1919. The 1919 pandemic was actually a singular event in the history of infectious diseases. Aside from being a catastrophic period of death and pain, it was actually a moment of triumph. It was a moment of triumph of evidence-based medicine. And it really represented a sea change from earlier models of infectious diseases, in earlier models of epidemiology and earlier models of medical education. In fact, it was during this period that two institutions, which were relatively young, relatively new, did not yet represent the mainstream of medicine in America. I'm talking about the Rockefeller University, and I want to give a shout out. That's my beloved wife, Kara's alma mater. She's sitting on this call. Rockefeller University, there on the Upper East Side, and Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore were relatively young, relatively new, but both played a pivotal role in the transition to understanding infectious diseases in a modern way. And I'm indebted to the wonderful work, The Great Influenza by John Barry, which talks about this development of medicine under this new categories of infectious disease. At the same time, in 1919, the basic alleviation of the pandemic was essentially impossible in the way that we understand it today. There was an awareness of the efficaciousness of vaccines, but at the same time, there were real limitations on therapeutics research, on production of therapeutics and vaccines, on testing and regulation. There really was no regulatory apparatus in the United States, at least, to really address the outbreaks of pandemic disease. In fact, just if you want to really go to the bottom line, the very basic germ theory of disease transmission was still a subject of debate, if you can believe that, right? A significant swath of American medical education was still very much based in the 19th century and did not quite agree with the idea of transmission of disease through germs, through viruses, et cetera. So the only real method of alleviation of disease at this time was what we would call today mitigation techniques: masks, hygiene, social distancing, and isolation, quarantine. The current pandemic, right? The world has changed, but strangely in 2020 we saw many of these lessons ignored. We have the science, we have the knowledge about vaccines, we have the ability to produce, test, regulate, administer vaccines, but we have thus faced a similar magnitude of illness and death as we saw in 1919, but with the US disproportionately impacted. In 1919, about 50 million deaths, of which 675,000 occurred in the United States. In 2020, 2021, the current statistics, as of 2 days ago, 3.3 million deaths worldwide, 577,000 deaths in the United States, right? So there's a real tweaking of the proportions there relative to 1919. So there's not a similar sea change of understanding in infectious disease today, but it's still too early to tell if what we've learned from this pandemic is really going to have as dramatic an impact on the development of medicine as we saw in the 1920s. So let's go back to 1919 again. 1919, Jews worldwide were in a very precarious situation. The approximate Jewish population of Europe at the time was around 10.5 million. This was the overwhelming majority of Jews in the world. They were in existential danger for this entire interwar period. There was a desperate need for providing support in the wake of a massive humanitarian refugee crisis, which affected significant swaths of the Jewish world in crisis. The Jews were literally on the road trying to escape the place they were at. And we're mostly talking about Eastern Europe, the former Russian Empire. Eastern Europe, we had the cataclysm of the Eastern Front to begin with, the collapse of the Russian Empire and the resulting Russian, German, Austrian hostilities, the Russian Revolution and Civil War, and then finally the beginnings of a border crisis with the new Republic of Poland, right, that numbered in Jewish victims in the hundreds of thousands of non-combatant Jewish victims, literally living in a war zone that stretched from Lithuania all the way to Romania, okay? There's a massive refugee crisis provoked by this. We also saw factionalization within the Jewish world as a response to these crises. We see an intensification of Jewish political activity in all forms, lobbying, philanthropy. In Western Europe and in North America, we see Jews elected to elected office, representative of non-Jewish parties. And in Eastern Europe, primarily in Poland, the newly reconstituted Republic of Poland, right, we see Jewish political parties entering the fray. But so we have factionalization and division at the same time as a major crisis in the Jewish world. Turning to the United States during this period, the period ending World War I around 1918 was actually right in the middle of a phase in American history running from about 1877 and the brokered convention of 1877 through the 1930s of in isolation and consolidation of a nativist concept of Americanness. So World War I, we had an international agreement and significant backlash in the United States. If you'll remember, the United States rejected the League of Nations Treaty. And you already had a major wave of Jewish immigration that had begun in the 1880s. Already in the 1890s, you had nativist assertions that this wave of Jewish immigration was bringing pandemic level infections with them in this point in the 1890s in the form of tuberculosis, which was actually referred to in some of the periodical literature as the Jewish disease or as the Taylor's disease. Taylor's disease was shorthand for Jewish disease. So you have a growth of US nativism. It was during this period that the second Ku Klux Klan emerged as a major nationwide social organization, right? We tend to forget this was actually a kind of a club that put on picnics and had barbecues and burnt a cross here or there and lynched a person here or there, but that was the KKK in the 1920s and 30s. You had Jim Crow laws in place, and you had Jews existing in America in a very complex relationship to this very difficult racial situation in America. And thus there was a significant increase at the moment where more Jews were seeking sanctuary in the United States, a significant rise in US nativism. And you saw things such as this quotation, right, given by a medical professional saying this: the foreign element, referring to Jews and Italians, the foreign element gives us much trouble when the epidemic occurs. They pay no attention to the rules or orders issued by the health department in the efforts to check disease. So a kind of blaming of immigrants for epidemic level tuberculosis. So we have a study, though, by a more recent study by Professor Alan Kraut of American University, who kind of looked into this. What was the impact on immigration by as the result of pandemic, of the 1918-19 pandemic? And what he found was, interestingly, it did increase sentiments of nativism that already existed in America, but it did not actually seem to create any new form of anti-Semitism. In other words, anti-Semitism was already here. The pandemic did not kind of hyper accelerate spread of anti-Semitism, but stretch the timeline out a couple of years past 1920, and we get to 1924 and the passage of some of the most draconian, up until the last presidential administration, the most draconian anti-immigration laws in American history in 1924, which was very much almost explicitly targeting Jews as well as Italians. So let's turn one more theater, and that's Mandate Palestine. The mandate was actually not formally granted to Great Britain until 1920, so we're still dealing with kind of the aftermath of the British military occupation after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. The Yishuv, the Jewish Yishuv, had a significant history of infectious disease, especially cholera was really endemic to the Yishuv. But the destructive impact of the war on the Yishuv and the necessity of self-defense and preservation because of Ottoman and Arabic hostility towards the Yishuv led to actually a fairly unified response to the pandemic. Although we have very little data, there's very little material actually recorded on how the Yishuv responded to the 1918-1919 flu pandemic, we do have a little bit of information. The fact is that the Yishuv was largely agrarian at this point. Lower rates of contact, thus lower rates of infection and death, but there were also lower rates of infection and death in the cities. There was widespread awareness in the Yishuv Committee and widespread compliance with hygienic measures. You actually had announcements hung on the walls all over Yerushalayim and Tzfat and Tiberia, saying, you have to wash your hands, you have to keep your closed, keep your windows closed, keep your distance from other people. There are actually mitigation measures that were fairly widely complied with by the Yishuv. And we have like one statistic that kind of says in Shaare Tzedek Hospital in 1920, we only had about 40 patients by 1920 admitted for acute influenza and pneumonia. So let's switch to 2020. How have things changed, right? The primary issues of concern in the Jewish world circa today, and I just kind of listed a few of them. I know there's more than this, but this is kind of a thumbnail sketch. First of all, always the status and security of Israel, right? Second, I say almost as important are issues of identity, questions in the United States of assimilation, of separation, of communal continuity. This is especially an important question in the US. The spectrum of tolerance in the religious world, in religious expressions of Judaism for elements of modern society and culture, such as do we tolerate LGBTQ in our community, issues of personal status. All of these issues are coming more and more up to the fore. Then we go to the heightened political atmosphere of intolerance globally, including in Europe, including the United States and Israel, abrupt increase of anti-Semitism in Europe and the United States, and increased tension in Israel. And finally, anxiety and conflict over the origins and significance of anti-Semitism in the present day. I think these are kind of some of the these are at least the things that were really on my radar in terms of thinking what people are concerned with. So in the United States, let's break it down. In the United States, the overwhelming number of American Jews identify generally with an American identity and cultural values that are relevant and associated for the most part with their socioeconomic position. And this is important to kind of keep in mind because really in America, right, the first real outbreak or one of the two central outbreaks of the coronavirus was in New Rochelle, right, which is basically my community. It was also affected the YU community, affected my kid at SAR, right? And the minority of Jews, there are a minority of Jews of the Orthodox, and then a sub-minority of that minority that I'm gonna, for lack of a better term, refer to as ultra-Orthodox, who identify outside the American mainstream and thus take on disproportionate attention vis-a-vis public issues. So they're more visible when these kind of large global emergencies occur. Their reaction is tracked more attentively because of their separation, in a sense. So in this, we see divisions and positions taken by each group are representative of a wider connection to social and political identities beyond the Jewish community. In other words, the Jewish community isn't necessarily defining how people's attitude towards the pandemic is characterized. Orthodox Jews, who tend to skew conservative on the American political continuum, right, tend to also reflect general patterns in American society at large, although a little bit differently. Although most Jews across the board, including in the Orthodox world, have complied with health guidelines, where larger resistance occurs within these communities, it takes on the same form as non-Jewish resistance, right? In other words, where you see this happening in the Jewish community, you see it among anti-vaxxers, you see it among more inflamed political communities, and I'm thinking in particular of Heshi Tischler out in Brooklyn, right? We sort of see this kind of thing happening. So anti-Semitism in the United States coincides and resonates in expected ways with the growing visibility of anti-Semitism generally. And there are two primary tropes when it comes in terms of COVID. First of all, identifying Jews because of acts of a minority with non-compliance. Now, this accusation, which shaded with anti-Semitism, trends left, okay? The second form is a more conspiratorial or classic anti-Semitic attitude. Jews are associated with conspiracies either in spreading the disease, benefiting from the disease, manufacturing the disease, or benefiting or manipulating the vaccines. Now, this trends right or alt-right, okay? So it's not clear whether COVID is specifically associated with an increase in anti-Semitic attitudes or incidents. In Israel, the clear, obvious difference between 1919 and 2020 is we have a Jewish state, right? So the pandemic and security, and it's very likely that the general homogeneity of Israel as a Jewish state, despite deep internal divisions and a sense of collective responsibility, has had a large impact on its success in vaccination, which we all know, we've all seen the news. It's also important from a PR perspective, and it can be seen in the same framework as Israel as a sort of can-do nation, a sort of startup nation. At the same time, it exacerbates internal divisions, especially with regard to the Haredim in Israel. Haredi responses, though, are in line with an element of expansive autonomy of the Haredi community, which we have seen, sadly, Nebuch an example of in the disaster in Har Meron just last week. The historical suspicion of the government likely among Haredi groups likely exacerbated the lack of compliance. At the same time, overall large success in vaccination, even Haredi circles, does mirror the American Jewish community. So in both the United States and Israel, there's a common pattern. Compliance or resistance to mitigation measures and or vaccination tends to reflect wider pre-existing cultural political context. So then there's also one particular special issue that needs to be addressed in terms of Israel, and that is the Palestinians, right? While the situation is very complex, it's easily given to snap an impressionistic judgment based upon the tension of the situation between Israel and the Palestinians. So again, while the earlier dynamic sets the stage for perception and misunderstanding of events, at the same time, Israel's in a very precarious position vis-a-vis the Palestinian population and international law and opinion. And I'm sure some of you have seen some examples of that. So in conclusion, in what ways does looking at the two data points of 1919 and 2020 give us a different perspective on modern Jewish history? In both, it tracks by and large with trends already in place or underway, but accelerated, right? In the early 20th century, increased nativism as related to, but not primarily caused by the pandemic, leads to an association of immigrants with disease, but the effect isn't really felt until 1924 when the draconian restriction of Jewish immigration emerges out of this nativist atmosphere. In the current situation, it's still too early, I think, to see a similar pattern, to discern a similar pattern, though some trends do seem to be emerging. Number one, there's an increasing friction between Jews who identify strongly with overt religious identity and those whose identity is entwined with modern culture. Secondly, there's an increased polarization and movement in groups to like-minded groups. And in this case, in America, we are seeing kind of a real polarization that also affects the Jewish community between the increasingly strident right, increasingly progressive left. The largest takeaway, though, I go back to my thesis, is that the basic premise of insecurity versus security in Jewish history is borne out. Jews in the United States and Israel have confidence to adapt attitudes towards illness, mitigation, and vaccination that align not with an internal Jewish imperative to protect the community in a time of instability and danger, but with a resonant, larger ideology, whether it be a political identity in the United States or a relationship to the state, as in Israel. Thanks for letting me have some comments here.
Thank you very much, Jess. So I'm just going to remind everybody to, if they have any questions, to please type them into the chat, and we should be able to put them to our panel, whether to a particular panelist or to everybody together. I'll also take this opportunity to, number one, thank all our panelists, Dr. Hidary, Dr. Perelis, Dr. Olson, for their fascinating remarks. And also, as mentioned earlier, just say that kind of we have here represented tonight 3 of the 6 departments that we have at Revel. So if you've enjoyed it so far, then please feel free to join us at Revel, whether to take a degree, to audit a course. I should mention courses are going to remain accessible remotely even when we return to in-person teaching. And please feel free to contact us, and I'll put these details up at the end of the evening as well. But for the moment, at this point, I'm going to open up to see if there are any questions, whether from those who are out there listening, or indeed that our panelists might have for each other. Please do type in anything you wish to ask, unless it's Ronnie, Jess, or Ricky, in which case you can just unmute yourselves and ask. Do we have anything coming up here in the chat? Let us see. I was actually, I mean, I'll just kind of one thing that came to mind for me. Certainly listening to Professor Hidary, we all are aware of the nexus between the, plague such as it was and a messianic movement, basically. I was just interested in whether, and it's not something I've actually seen in the current pandemic particularly, that I'm aware of at any rate. So I was just wondering whether there was any sort of reaction in terms of messianism, either in the medieval period, in the period that you're talking about, Ronnie, or even back 100 years ago, whether there was anything within Judaism, any sort of, push to some kind of messianic fervor as a result, or if that was just, it so happened that that's the nexus back there. Just unmute, Ronnie.
Sorry. Ricky, do you want to address that first? Because it starts with your period.
Well, I mean, I think Professor Reinhold's point was that in the Talmudic period that Rabbi Akiva went along, that was part and parcel of a messianic force. So maybe that destruction. So I mean, I remember like a year ago, people making all kinds of gematrias and finding pandemic and different places in the Torah. So maybe now is a good example. But yeah, Professor Perelis, you can maybe speak to that.
I mean, what's interesting, in Susan Einbinder's work, her main argument is that actually, at least, in Jewish reaction to the devastations of the plague, both biological in terms of people dying, and also the violence that erupted around it against Jews. Actually, her argument is that Jews actually responded the way they've responded to everything, in kind of a very, she didn't notice a break. You don't have people questioning God. You don't have people questioning, people respond in the normal way, teshuvah, tzedakah, tefillah, waiting for tzipiyah yeshua, waiting for for redemption, but in sort of a quiet, much more of a quietist mode. She studies graves, and she studies where you start to see that change is around the expulsion, and that I think is easy to argue. I mean, that's easy to see. Although there have been, there's pushback on that thesis, but I think it's really hard to not see it. I mean, everyone, the expulsion in 1492 was such a massive watershed blow to world Jewry. And it coincided at a time when Jews are being kicked out of all these other places also, right? I mean, the Jews of Ashkenaz are basically no longer in Ashkenaz. They've almost entirely been pushed out as well. So it's a moment, for the 15th century is a moment of tremendous upheaval. And that's when you see, as Gershom Shalom argued, the emergence of Lurianic Kabbalah with the centrality of Messianism. Whereas if you look at the Zohar and other forms of medieval Kabbalah, Mashiach is obviously everywhere, but it's not everything. What really is everything is Dveikut and all these other important ideas. But then, you if you wait a little while, then you'll see it. So the plague, these were seen as the normal existential, tough, difficult, painful things of life that we have the tools to deal with. We know what to do. Like, Professor Hidary said, there's the medical pieces to it. And then there's the tefillah and the tzedakah, and that people figured out how to respond to. Even after the incredible riots of 1391 in Spain, it takes a while for the after effects to kind of reach a point of messianism. That's going to take a little while. Yeah.
If I can just say, I think the same thing is true today. I'm going to be very curious to see how things unfold for the next few years. And I'm thinking, especially, honestly, I mentioned the Har Maron disaster last weekend, and I wouldn't be surprised if there's some linkage in terms of that, and thinking about and I don't know where that's going to go,
right,
in connection to this, because to see an event that so singularly strikes, right, the Haredi community in such a profound way, really a real challenge to one's emunah, right? That in the context, I'd be very curious, in the next few years to see if that evolves into anything along those lines.
We have one question here for Dr. Perelis, which is, from Isaac Mann, whether the idea of a dance of death could be related to the movements of people who had various involuntary movements of their limbs before they died.
Oh, I don't know. I'm not so physiological about this, but Michelle Hamilton, who studies this Judeo-Spanish version of the Dance of Death, follows the etymology of macabre, right? M-A-C-R-B-E, and links it to the Arabic and the Hebrew. This is a theory. She doesn't say this is definitely it, but for kvura, right? So it's the dance of the Macabrim.
Huh.
That actually, this word that sounds so French may actually have a Semitic root, whether it's an Arabic or Hebrew root, and that it was related to some sort of ritual dance, kind of a solemn ritual dance of the the Chevra Kadisha, so to speak, which is really interesting. It's not my investigation. It's something I've read in Michelle Hamilton's excellent work on that Dance of Death, theme. But so, look, I mean, and anyone who's ever seen, a Grateful Dead T-shirt, it's right. We're all dealing, these are kind of tropes that keep on coming up in society, whether it has to do with I'm not sure. I mean,
there is Saint Vitus dance, right? The illness associated with involuntary spasms. Saint Vitus is, I don't know if that has any connection to the Dance Macabre.
Interesting.
Yeah. So halacha speaks about hakafot at a funeral that some communities still do today. To walk around 7 times. The poem that is recited while they make the hakafot is in the Solar Pool Sidur.
Oh, wow. Which communities still do that?
Spanish Portuguese, I think they stopped for a while, then they started, it has been done recently.
And it's 7 or it's just 1 or?
7.
Wow. Okay.
Only done for a man when Tachanun is said.
So no chol moed hakafot.
Right.
Fascinating.
Wow. Any other questions? Yeah.
I have a question for Ricky, which is, the move to see an ethical cause. Do you see that in other places? Can you map that out in other places in Shas? I mean, is that in the world of Chazal?
Yeah, I think this here during the Bar Kokhba time is parallel to destruction of the second Bet HaMikdash because of sinat chinam, baseless hatred.
Right.
So I think they see both because they're looking around at themselves and at the other groups and they see people are learning Torah, people are very pious, people are extremely strict about every detail of Tumah and Tahara. Even the groups that they disagree with are still very strict, even if they have different interpretations of it. So they don't see the Ben Adam Lamakom as at that period of time, unlike in the first Bet HaMikdash. But I think they do recognize that the social structures, the fighting over every little thing, and while the Romans are just watching, and the Jews are fighting over, should we sacrifice this animal with a small blemish that the emperor sent? No, we can't do it. What if people will come to think that this is something allowed, and then they allowed the whole Bet HaMikdash to be destroyed because of it. And this came up in Daf Yomi just a couple of days ago, the famous story about the 2 Kohanim running up the ramp to get there first so that they can serve. And one in one version pushes the other and the other stabs the other and falls off. And the father comes and says, oh, wait, take out the knife quickly before it becomes tameh. So, the rabbis are telling that story to say, and they say explicitly, you see, the tum'ah is more important to them than even murder.
We've got here, among some circles, recitation of the Torah is seen as helpful to fight the plague. Is there any notion of that in the Talmud or earlier Jewish history?
Yeah, it's in the Torah, right?
Right.
Yes. So absolutely.
Okay. And one here, which I suppose Professor Olson sort of said he's interested to see, so I don't know that he would have an answer in terms of how the man-made Har Meron disaster would affect Haredi Emunah.
I mean, I could just tell you what I've encountered in my own reading, and I would characterize it this way, that there's very much a question of the meaning, the transcendent meaning of this event. I don't think that, I'm not going to speak for everybody, but I do think there is at least a tendency of a trend to interpret the event not as a man-made disaster, but as a disaster that does have significance in terms of the relationship between Klal Yisrael and HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right? That is how it is being understood. Now, does it affect the Emunah in the sense that people are losing Emunah? Because no, I don't think so. It is a call to strengthen Emunah. It's a call to strengthen Tshuva. It's a call. I mean, I've even seen things in terms of even more aggressively literal interpretations of the meaning. But I think all of those things fall under the category of emunah, right? That this is as is understandable. It's interpreted in an event on Log BaOmer at the kever of the Rashbi, right? How do you not experience it in some term, right, like that? So I don't think it's really such a controversial observation.
Right. Well, certainly, yeah. Coming more to mine, to kind of my area of Jewish philosophy. I mean, theodicy, as we know, goes back literally to it's the one philosophical question that there's basically a book of Tanakh dedicated to. So, so certainly that's something that is always going to be present. Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting. It's interesting that you definitely had many more COVID deaths than the 45 people who died, sadly, last week. And yet the introspection is happening on this event. You didn't hear much introspection during COVID. You didn't hear, it's not that I'm aware of, right? Within people saying, is this a wake-up call? It's time for tshuva. It's a time for tzedakah. It's a time for tikkun. I'm not aware of a widespread kind of introspection. And yet it's interesting. There's something interesting. I mean, I don't like using that. Maybe that's not the right word, but there's something provocative about the fact that this terrible event is bringing out those questions. But maybe they were prepped by months of loss that for some reason, you can deal with. The loss of someone dying from a disease is different. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So I think with that, we'll probably bring the evening to a close unless there are any further questions. What I do want to do is just thank everybody for coming, for attending. Enormous thanks to Dr. Hidary, Dr. Perelis, Dr. Olson for sharing with us of their expertise. And finally, if you liked what you heard this evening, or as I always say, or better, if you didn't like what you heard and you want to come and discuss and argue about it, then please do come join us at Revel, sign up, be in touch with Rona Steinemann, whose email is there, and very much hope that you gain something from this evening and hope to see you at future Revel events. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
Night. Thank you, guys. That was really great.